From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. I'm Mary Uy from Conservation Division, and welcome to Preservation Week at the Library of Congress. Preservation Week is an initiative started in 2009 by several organizations, including the library, to raise awareness for preservation of cultural heritage. Today's event is our second and last Preservation Week 2016 program, and our 78th Topics in Preservation Series lecture. Excuse me. Andrew Robb is head of special format conservation and oversees the care of the library's 15 million photographs. He is also responsible for the library's preservation emergency response team and serves on the library's emergency management team. He acts as the library's point of contact for federal emergency plans related to cultural resources. He has been a co-chair of the Emergency Committee of the American Institute for Conservation and is a member of the National Heritage Responders. Andrew received an MS in Art Conservation with a major in Photograph Conservation and a minor in Paper Conservation from the University of Delaware Winterthur Art Conservation Program. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Mary. Do I have all the mics right? Welcome everybody that's in the auditorium, as well as about 78 people out in the ether. So I hope everybody can hear me. We have 3 microphones. It feels quite impressive up here. So let's start. So today's topic is about heritage emergency management and the Florence Flood. I've changed the title slightly since we put up the announcement because there's some things I'm going to talk about that are from before the Florence Flood, but it's a good touchstone for how things have developed both up to that point and after that point. It really is a central moment in both our field as well as in the broader area of emergency management. So let's just review a little bit about the Florence Flood. Many of us saw the Zeffirelli film yesterday, which is an excellent way of just really getting into the feeling of that moment and how desperate and horrible it was. It was in November of 1966, and it started because of heavy rainfalls above Florence that came down the Arno River and went through the center of Florence. It also flooded close to a third of the northern part of Italy. So Venice was also affected. It was not just a local disaster, it was a national disaster of very, very large, that was very large. Obviously, Florence is a cultural center, and an enormous amount of cultural resources were damaged. 3 to 4 million books and manuscript materials, as well as close to 14,000 works of art. And many of these truly iconic works of art that certainly grabbed the world's attention. As you can see on the right, these are pictures from a National Geographic article from 1967 that's quite oftenly cited as a way of the people were continually interested in this, and it is quite difficult to understand how impactful things like that article were at the time, in a time when we have the internet and cable news. The images of this and the film were quite important in terms of conveying to people the extent of the damage. Extremely high waters, and also moving at a very high speed, so very destructive and full of heating oil. So dirty, moving at great force, at times over 20 feet. This is the following day. The rain started on November 3rd. Flooding started in the very early morning of November 4th, and this picture is probably in the afternoon of November 4th or the following day on the 5th, but probably on the 4th. You can see the Ponte Vecchio to orient yourself back here. The worst flooding is just, if you're following the river, just up the river here, and that's Santa Croce, where an extensive number of artworks were damaged, and you can see that, you can see the aftermath below you. The north side of the river was more badly affected than the south side, and that's why people are able to gain access. It's a little higher ground. But you can see the extent of the water after the rainfall has stopped. It's close to the height of the first story of the cloister. So all of the artwork that's at that level was submerged underwater. Like a lot of emergencies, we'll have this recurrent theme that while they happen unexpectedly, they don't happen in a completely random way. Florence had a series of floods throughout the centuries, easily 4 other major floods in 1333, 1557, 1966, and 13 other minor floods since 1557. And you can get a sense of the timing by various markers throughout the city that are marking the 1557 flood, the 1966 flood, the 1333 flood. That these are certainly witnesses as you're walking through the town, looking up close to 20 feet up of the extent of what can happen and had happened. We saw a lot of this yesterday when we're watching the movie, and the efforts of just reclaiming the city, enormous. Come back to this, but this shows you sort of, even by the first few days, few weeks, lots of efforts to stabilize very important works of art that were completely submerged underwater. You can see here the line of how high the water got. So very extensive. The Last Supper was faced with paper. A lot of paintings were treated that way to stabilize them. In this case, it was on a series of panels. We'll come back to this later, but was stabilized and treated at a later time. How much later we'll get into in a bit. As I said, it wasn't only artworks, it was also library materials. What we would describe as the National Library of Italy is actually in Florence, and it was extremely damaged. It was also in an area that received a lot of flooding. Close to 70,000 rare volumes and over 1.5 million general collection items. And you can see the reading room area is being used as a triage area where things are coming out from the stacks. And this is where you get a sense of those that came to help and assist with the recovery, the mud angels. And it was muddy. It was muddy for days and weeks. So that sort of gets you through the initial response. We saw a lot of that in yesterday's viewing of the film. The initial salvage, getting things out from areas that so they could be stabilized and treated. The story for the Library of Congress in many ways starts here because our founding chief of conservation, Peter Waters, was at that time not at the library. He was still working as a bookbinder in England, but he came to head the recovery, the long-term recovery, and treatment of items after the floods. So this is a lab that he set up to start that work. And as part of that work, he brought in colleagues Don Etherington, Chris Clarkson, among others. What's interesting is all 3 of them eventually came here and were essentially many of our founding leaders in the conservation division. And I think we carry a legacy of that experience because of the way they set up the lab and the way they thought about dealing with scale and the way they thought about dealing with important objects. It was very much formed in the crucible of Florence. you can see below on the left, these are items of volumes that still remain untreated, but they're stabilized. And we'll come back to that theme. It's very similar to the Vasari Last Supper. Items are stabilized, but they may not be fully treated for years, if not decades. And I think this is something that as we look back at Florence and we look at other more recent emergencies, we should be more mindful of this and speak more clearly about that difference. I'll talk about that in a second. But these are stable. They're not going to get worse, but they're not fully treated. They're shelved and can be retrieved and treated as needed. So this leads me to why am I giving this talk? I was not a mud angel. I was about one. I was busy watching baseball. As many of you know, that's a great interest of mine, as is monochromatic images, which is also interesting to think of how far back these interests go in my life. But I was here when Peter was here. I'm right back here. All that person with all that hair, right there. That's me. So I did get the privilege of working with Peter. And interestingly, we rarely talked about Florence. We mainly talked about the point system and the computers that were brought into the lab. So apples don't fall far from the trees either. I spend a lot of time in front of computers now. But Peter's impact on the lab was enormous, and it was a real privilege to be able to work with him and to just understand where he was coming from in terms of the way our lab worked. But as I said, I had an interest in photography, images, and I became a photograph conservator. So again, that's wonder, why would you become interested in emergency response? Well, partly because when you have a lot of photographs, of which we do, they're quite vulnerable. And they're the kind of object that you worry about when you have emergencies, floods, or even smaller incidents. And so pulling all this together, after Florence, 1975, Peter published Salvage of Water Damaged Library Materials, which is an incredibly useful and practical book even today. It's something I still refer to on a fairly regular basis, just for practical, common sense ways of dealing with large-scale emergencies. Unfortunately, Klaus Hendricks at the National Archives of Canada at the time, and Brian Lesser, published a really important paper about the recovery of photographs in these kinds of incidents. It's an enormously good complement to this article. To Peter's book, in 1983. And so by the time I was in school, graduate school, this was a fundamental text for me in terms of understanding how to help and assist people as they ask questions or need assistance in terms of an emergency. And the core thing that comes out of Florence, among many core things, besides the development of professionalism, of labs like our own, is a real sense of what can we do better? What tools can we use? What kinds of technology can we use? And it really comes down to people really thinking hard about, can we freeze materials, dry them in other ways so that we buy ourselves time so we don't have to worry about things like mold, increasing damage because things are waterlogged. And because of Peter and many others that were focusing on how to improve response and recovery methods, we typically recommend, particularly for library materials, that you freeze it. If you have the scale and you have the resources to not freeze it and to air dry it and do, in some cases, a full treatment, that obviously is preferable. But if you don't have those options, freezing is a very viable solution, and it's something that now we have a very robust set of a whole industry around this and a real sense of experience and scale, where this is a vacuum chamber that is quite large. So this comes out of a sense of hospitals, law firms, people with records. Emergencies happen frequently. We don't always hear about them, but water incidents, they happen. And a whole industry has come out since Florence surrounding the assistance of these kinds of incidents, and these kinds of capacities exist in a way that they did not at Florence. So we'll circle back to the Library of Congress where we are, where Peter started the lab, where he initiated a lot of important conservation approaches, what we now call collection stabilization, which at the time we called phase conservation, how to deal with scale, how to deal with important objects at the same time. We have 3 very large buildings. We have close to, I think, 150 million objects located on Capitol Hill in these 3 buildings here, just to give you a sense, if you're unfamiliar with our buildings. 3 very large buildings full of collections. In our experience then going back with, so we have Peter was at Florence, he came and set up the lab, but at the library we also have another legacy that has to do with, we've experienced, oh, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. These are some of the 140 million things ranging from Thomas Jefferson's original library, our second founding library, I'll get into that in a moment, iconic objects like the Gutenberg Bible, Declaration of Independence draft, pre-Columbian objects, musical instruments, photographs, as well as many, many, many books, some of which are on the floor, unfortunately. So let's go back to, so where did we start? Well, we started as truly a legislative library in this part of the original Capitol building. Not a very large library, and not a particularly expansive one. And it was burned in the War of 1812. In 1814, the British came down Maryland Avenue, burned the Capitol, and the library was destroyed. And why is this relevant for us? Well, in many ways, we are the way we are because the decision to purchase Thomas Jefferson's library to replace it gave us the mandate that we still hold to have an encyclopedic collection of human creativity and knowledge. We're the only national library that has such a broad mandate in the sense that other national libraries typically are collecting in either their nation or their language. Close to 2/3 of our new acquisitions in terms of just our books are in foreign languages. And we have an extremely broad and collecting mandate, both in terms of breadth and depth. And that comes directly because of the way we responded to the fire and the loss of our original library. We grew very quickly during the 19th century, suffered a number of fires. Sadly, many of the volumes of Thomas Jefferson's original library were lost in those fires. And so the building of the Jefferson building in the late 19th century was in direct response to that. It has very little wood in it. It's made out of metal, stone, glass, in ways that were really meant to protect items from fire. So we're very mindful of this. It's why we have the collection we have. It's why we have the mission we have. And we've continued to do this, both in terms of what Peter carried on, in terms of I'm including him here as having worked in Florence. Obviously, he wasn't here at the time. He had not quite gotten here. But we do a lot of work in terms of both outreach, assisting people, training people, as well as I'll get into in a moment, working on federal policy and national policy on this issue. We take it seriously, and it's something that we're quite committed to, not just in our part of the library, but across the library, as I'll refer to in a moment. So when we talk about broader, take a step back and look at federal institutions and federal cultural institutions, we're the first federal cultural institution founded in 1800. The Smithsonian follows us in 1846, followed by the National Park Service for our natural patrimony that we have. National Archives is formed in 1934 to aggregate federal records in a way that had not been done before, and we have the National Gallery in 1941. There are a few other federal cultural institutions, and I'm not leaving them out. I'm leaving them out, but I'm including them here. I'm not including them here because, as we'll see, as we start getting into federal initiatives that have to do with heritage emergency and response, these are the core federal agencies that both have the technical experience as well as the background of having experienced either losses or contributing to other kinds of efforts. These are the core 5. we talk about support agencies, there was really very little federal support for collections before the 1960s. And we have the creation of NEA in 1965, NEH in 1965, IMLS in 1996 formally, but has antecessors in 1976 and 1956. These are support agencies in the truest sense. They do not have collections. They are not responsible for them, but they support others who hold those things. And we have a very decentralized way of caring for our cultural heritage. Other countries have ministries of culture where the National Library not only runs its national collection, but it runs all of the libraries underneath it. We don't follow that model. And NEA, NEH, IMLS are ways that we support the efforts that are happening at a state or local level. And they're modeled after the National Science Foundation, which was formed in 1950 to do the same kind of thing in support of science and other kinds of efforts. One of the reasons why this is going on, if you're looking at other kinds of efforts that we've made that really I think are important, the Monuments Men and essentially the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives is their formal name, organized to protect initially things in the European theater during World War II, both to protect them from being in a war front, and also in repatriating items that had been stolen or looted during the war. So this is something that, as we're looking at federal policy, is an important way that even in times of war, there was a recognition that cultural patrimony, cultural heritage was something important, and important enough that, in fact, as commander of all of the forces of the Allies, General Eisenhower commanded that all officers take this into account, and officers were seconded to work with them to protect these items if at all possible. One of our founding fathers in the field of conservation is George Stout, and he's here with the helmet and the N. He was in the Navy. He was very proud of that. And this is where they're recovering the Ghent altarpiece that had been removed during the war. So in this way, very similar, iconic artworks that attempts were made to save them during the war. And remember, this is really in the period of 1943 to 1945. So to get into federal legislation, so we have cultural institutions, but we're decentralized in the sense that those cultural institutions have a primary responsibility for their collections. They don't have as strong a priority in terms of caring for other people's collections. We have a cleaner divide than in other places. But we do have federal legislation that starts coming into play to protect both items that are in the nation that we feel like are worthy of caring for them. So we have the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. And it has some antecessors or antecedents in 1935, 1960, but essentially we create a National Register of Historic Sites. This is quite important as we get into some of the ways in which we respond to emergencies. And it's essentially been amended to include not just historic sites, but also archaeological objects, shipwrecks, Native American material, both in grave sites as well as archaeological sites, maritime areas, battlefields, lighthouses. And all of these have a real legal protection if federal money is involved, and it requires a review of the impact of any kind of federal action on these areas. And this really comes out of a sense during the 60s that because of increased building, post-war building, the highway system, a number of things where the federal government is actually spending a fair amount of money, that items and important buildings and environments are being lost. And so this is a way to protect them. Doesn't always mean that the federal government owns them. Usually it means that they don't. It just means that these things have a status that requires review before federal action takes place. So the National Register is something you'll see plaques. If you go over to St. Mark's Church, which is right behind the Adams building, you'll see it's on the National Register. And it's precisely on the National Register because St. Mark's didn't want to be the next church that got torn down as the library continued its march east. It's there, that's on the National Register to stop that from happening, in theory. One of the things, though, that's interesting, if you read the highest level language of the NFPA Act, it describes that the Secretary of the Interior is authorized to expand and maintain a National Register of Historic Places comprised of districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. So that seems like that would cover objects. But in fact, it doesn't cover objects. Generally, the notion is that objects have to be associated with that site to be covered by the National Register. And in fact, commentary, not so much legislation, but certainly commentary on how to implement this explicitly describes, excuse me, that objects that are in a museum are not appropriate for the National Register. So when you're talking about what these laws do, essentially the built environment, things that are outdoors, have a lot of protection. Things that are indoors, collections, objects, are not protected in the same way, and we'll see why that's important in a second. A comparable set of legislation happened in 1970, the National Environmental Protection Act. And this is something where whenever you hear on the news that there's a project going on where they're waiting for an environmental impact assessment or some kind of environmental statement about what the project will do, it comes from this law. So between 1966 and 1970, we have two fundamental acts that describe how to take care of the built environment and how to take care of the natural environment. And the human environment comes into play with any APA because the human environment can include some kinds of cultural resources, like cemeteries in particular, where they're part of that environment, so that you have a slight crossover between these two acts. But again, it does not include what we would generally consider as collection objects. These projects in particular, we have another tie to at the library, in that the documentation around these historic structures, the sets of legislation that have to do with historic preservation include the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey. And all of those are Department of Interior, National Park Service projects that document that environment. And copies of those items, those drawings, come to us at the library, and we serve them as part of our collections. So we have a very direct link to that legislation in the sense that we benefit from that and build our collections around those activities. This is an interesting example of St. Michael's Cathedral in Sitka, Alaska. It was one of the first buildings in Alaska to be done as a part of the Habs work. And it burned down. And this is the church that was built from the Habs drawings. It was rebuilt using the material that we hold here. The landscape survey is somewhat newer, but it builds on that, and it's a way of documenting those kinds of landscapes that are protected in the 1970 legislation. So, this leads us to something that's really interesting about, at least in the United States, what do we call all of this material that is generated in terms of human creativity, human knowledge, that's what we use in our mission statement. Is it art? Is it cultural resources? Is it heritage? Is it collections? Is it historic materials, historic properties, material culture? Generally speaking, all of these terms get used. Increasingly, heritage is being used as that term to encompass all of those things. But keep in mind that all of those things have different legal status in the way that we respond, particularly in emergencies. And that's why I'm bringing this up. This is not just an American issue. It's an international issue. I was at a conference earlier in the spring where we easily spent a few hours talking about what culture is, how you take care of it, how you define it, how you do it in a way that's appropriate. If you're doing response, how you're including all the stakeholders in a cultural interaction. It can get quite complicated. And you can think of things in a hierarchy. National treasures, historic materials, personal property. And this is something I want to emphasize too, that while all I've been talking about are essentially things that are in collections, people have their own collections, families have their own collections, and that becomes an issue too in how we respond in emergencies and how we use our resources. So let's switch slightly to talk about some terms about emergencies and disasters. Florence is a disaster, and it's a kind of disaster that it's the sort of a keystone. If you're looking at the history of the field, a definition, it's something where you have severe property damage, deaths, and multiple injuries, and it can be from, and now in our, in our thinking, it can be caused by many different types of reasons. It can be a natural disaster, it can be a technological accident, it can be a human-caused event, an act of war, terrorism. Those are things that can all cause disasters. Emergencies tend to be a word that is somewhat less catastrophic, but it's something that requires responsive action to protect life or property. And then you can go a level down. If you're looking for a generic word, you can use the word incident to describe something that might be a disaster, might be an emergency, or might be actually something that requires response, but isn't actually even rising to the level of this. It's a level down, but it's a more generic term, and I'll try to use that word as much as I can. So similar to our history or timeline with cultural institutions, federal legislation about cultural property, emergency legislation, it has a similar arc. For many, many decades, the federal government really does not have a lot of legislation around this. It doesn't really build up legislation to protect things at a broad level. It's devolved essentially to states and local groups. The Civil Defense Act in 1950 changes that. It's a response to the Cold War, and it's very focused on acts of war, the Cold War, fears over atomic war. It's a very, very specific approach that does not include natural disasters. And it is only through a series of pretty catastrophic disasters in the 1960s, a very bad earthquake in Alaska, Hurricane Camille, Hurricane Betsy, that the Disaster Relief Act is passed in 1970 that tries to create ways that the federal government responds to emergencies. The National Governors Association in 1978 and 79 really focus on this and say that, well, you've done this, but you're not helping us enough. It's not coordinated. There are over 100 agencies that get involved on a national level, and yet it's not coordinated in a particularly good way. And that led to the creation of FEMA in 1979. And the founding of FEMA created two important concepts that we still follow today. Excuse me. The comprehensive emergency management notion, that is an all hazards approach. We're not just going to confine our planning to one type of disaster. We're going to create one system that can respond to all kinds of disasters. And we're going to have a structure, in this case incident command structure, that is scalable from the smallest incident to the largest catastrophe. We're going to have a single comprehensive approach. And that's important when we start talking about cultural property. The Stafford Act of 1988 truly codifies what we choose to do with FEMA and the executive agencies that respond to emergencies. So the Stafford Act is still referred to, and the Stafford Act is the way in which we respond to emergencies, and the various plans we have are an outgrowth of that legislation. There's a federal response plan first drafted in 1990. It truly is the first comprehensive, what we would call emergency plan. It's quite focused on civil defense, but it is the first real plan. We then have a national response plan in 1999 that incorporates a number of what are called emergency support functions. And the key thing here is that the emergency support function notion still exists today. Cultural property is in emergency support function 11, which is for natural and agricultural products in 1999. But for a variety of reasons, it makes sense that in 2008, ESF 11 creates a fourth section that is for natural and cultural resources. And that's the first time in a comprehensive way that cultural property is included in our thinking at a national level. We can go back to that Monumentsmen experience and these other senses of legislation and ways of protecting things, but in terms of how we respond in an emergency, it isn't until 2008 that we truly have things explicitly described of what we're going to do. And the key thing there is that a lot of the focus of even plans today and strategies and approaches to responding to emergencies today is very focused on where we have legislation, that is, our built and natural environment. It is not nearly as prescriptive about what we should be doing with cultural property that is inside buildings, collections. And that's because there is no legislation around that. So that's one of the things where we continue to be involved with these various plans, the National Response Framework, as well as the Disaster Response Framework, the National Disaster Response Framework, which came out in 2011, which has a recovery support function related to natural and cultural materials. So we serve on that committee in part to remind people that while many agencies have authorizations and budgets for taking care of historic properties and natural environments and mandates to do that, we're there as a voice for the items that are not protected by legislation. And it's not that these plans don't mention it or include it, but it's an important thing to keep in mind that we don't have a full complement of the resources that our historic structures and other things have. So let's go a little bit into emergencies, about halfway. People are going to come first. This is a very straightforward safety first kind of notion. It isn't just a national policy issue. It happens at an institutional level or even in a lab level. You then take care of buildings, and then you take care of things or collections or cultural property. So this is something that's also part of that hierarchy, that's part of that comprehensive approach. And there is a real tension that's similar to that natural disaster civil defense tension of should we have one plan or a comprehensive two different plans? Should we have them be different or the same? There's an ebb and flow in FEMA policy and national policy about that on a civil defense, natural disaster front. There's the same thing that happens here of should we really even be including things like cultural property in this, and I'll explain why that has prevailed. But let's just talk a little bit about what we do when we talk about emergency management. Emergency management as a field, as a profession, didn't really start until the creation of FEMA. That notion of a comprehensive approach, that notion of a scalable approach are core parts of what emergency managers do, but they did not exist, certainly at the time of Florence, and they didn't really exist until the early 1980s. There are four key components to that: preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And it's important to keep this in mind. You'll see, particularly in early preservation, conservation literature about emergency, they'll use one of these terms, preparedness, planning, response, recovery, and really what they should be, the word they really should be using is collection emergency management, or heritage emergency management, or art emergency management. But it's a cycle. They're all interrelated. You need to be doing all of them. You shouldn't be focusing just on one of them. And this is for a number of reasons, but part of it is a practical one. Emergency managers, our plans, our national policies, our work within this framework. And by far the fastest way to think about this is to use a medical analogy. Preparedness are the kinds of things you do to take care of yourself when you're not sick, but to keep yourself from being sick. They could be things like going to the doctor, having checkups, having health insurance, taking care of yourself. Response is what you do when something happens to you. And this is the important distinction between response and recovery. When you call 9/11, that's obviously response. When you start getting treated in the ambulance going to the hospital, that starts being recovery to some extent, but it clearly is also part of a response function. As you get into recovery, you're in the emergency room. There's more assessment, there's some triage that's done, some assessment, some treatment, but the goal at that stage of the emergency room cycle is get you stabilized. It's not to fully treat you, it's to get you stabilized. You are not going to get worse, you're alive, and now some other doctor, someone else can take care of you. They can move on to other people that have life-threatening situations. So a component of recovery is rehabilitation. And it's interesting, in many early parts of emergency literature in the conservation field, this notion of recovery and rehabilitation is stated. But over time, it gets less priority, it gets less attention. And I think that's too bad. And it's one of the things where I think that's where we're focusing on now. And Florence is an interesting lesson in all that. Recovery can take a long time, and that's not surprising. If you suffer a major health catastrophic event like a stroke or a heart attack and you live, you fully expect that you will have a long period of rehabilitation, and you might not ever fully recover. And that's a very similar kind of approach that happens with cultural property. This can take a long time, and these stages overlap. It's very confusing. You can have response from like, say, a people point of view start happening and end much before you even get into the collection space to start recovering it. So these terms are very confusing. This is a well-known discussion point in all of the emergency management literature, and so they overlap. It's confusing, it's chaotic, and it's important to keep in mind those terms and to understand that they will overlap, and that long-term recovery really will go on for months, if not years. One of our conundrums in cultural property area is that we have a very limited amount of time before we start seeing increased damage from an incident, because almost every incident involves water in some way, either as part of the incident or as part of the way of treating the incident in, say, a fire, or as part of some collateral component. It can be the cause, as in a flood, but it can also just be part of how you're putting out a fire. Water is a big problem. Cultural property is often organic, and mold is a huge, huge issue. And we don't have that long. We're trying to work on this theme of golden 100 hours. It's sort of similar to the golden, I think it's 3 or 4 hours you have if you have a stroke or a heart attack, you need to get to the hospital. And that isn't to say that you shouldn't go to the hospital after that period, but your chances of a full recovery are less. This is just a physical reality of the way mold and the environment works on inorganic materials. So this 3 to 4 day period is a very tight window when you're talking about particularly a catastrophic event. But it's a reality, and it's something that really focuses us so much on planning and preparedness because we'd like to avoid this in the first place. One of the other things that happens with recovery is that even, as I go back to here, things start returning back to normal. When you start having a building that's completely renovated and done, people are really tired of that incident and they want it to be done. So usually with catastrophic emergencies and disasters, there's some sort of marker that indicates when people, in their minds, most of them are done. And so with Florence, it's an exhibition in 1972. There was a very large incident that was about Florence restored, 1972. There was a lot of cultural material, and there still is to some extent cultural material that's not fully recovered or treated. But it's something to be mindful of too, that one of the disadvantages of freezing or other approaches is that it leaves us in a position where we often have a great deal of work after most people consider everything done. A lot of these notions are now enshrined in the relatively new National Disaster Recovery Framework. And it outlines how this rolls out. And this is incredibly important because as we're integrated into this, it allows us to be able to describe in a better way where we are and how we fit into this, and how so much of what our work is on an immediate level is with stabilization and not necessarily with full recovery. That rehabilitation is something that we have to do in the long term. And that's certainly the case with the Vasari Last Supper. it was still under treatment in 2013. And it was only earlier this year that the full treatment was completed, almost 50 years later. And that goes to the books. Most of the rare books that were in the National Library in Florence have been treated, but there's a good chunk of probably close to 8,000 books that still remain in this condition and need to be treated. It's part of long-term recovery, and we should be more explicit and clear about our expectations when we talk about what we're trying to do in emergency situations, what the outcome will be, what the expectation will be, and what we mean when we say stabilize. So let's just summarize a little bit. We know that we have a lot of disasters in our country. It's across the country. This is all of the federally declared emergencies that the Stafford Act describes how to do from 1965 until 2003. A pretty good span of time, almost 40 years of time. You can see that there's virtually no part of the country that isn't near or affected by some kind of presidentially declared emergency. That's a pretty significant bar. And some places have a lot of them, not surprisingly. Gulf Coast, earthquake areas, where there's a lot of snow, a lot of bad weather. We know we're going to have disasters, and we know that we have cultural material in all of these places. The National Register has almost, it's in the hundreds of thousands of things on the National Register. If we're talking about national parks, talking about cultural institutions, they're in almost every county that's delineated on this map. And we know, unfortunately, from Heritage Preservation Health Index from 2005, that we have a real lack of preparedness, that institutions, particularly small ones, do not have disaster plans where you have trained staff to implement them. People are not ready. And that's not good if you're going to have all these disasters. And Hurricane Katrina really pointed that out. That while we'd made a lot of advances, particularly in our field in terms of a profession that did not really exist at the time of Florence, or was at the very beginning of existing, we have a lot of literature, we have a lot of experience. As with emergency managers, we have a field that has expertise and knowledge that should be able to handle these kinds of situations, but we lack structures, infrastructure, and resources to sometimes do what we know we can do. And Katrina really pointed that out in 2005. It really, really, really was a disaster that was eye-opening in the sense of all of the things that we had done. It was an eye-opening thing to see how far short we fell. It was an enormously large regional disaster, covered many states, and one of the great American cities was under close to 80% of water, very similar to Florence. And while the cultural impact was not quite as great as Florence, it was certainly significant, as was the human cost and the way in which we responded both as a federal government and as a nation. There were a number of things that came out of the lessons from Katrina, and it's one of, I think, the stronger traits of American emergency management in general, is we do learn from the past, we make changes, we attempt to make things better from what we've learned. FEMA had become part of DHS after 9/11, but it was made more independent after Katrina so that it could really focus on emergency management at large. There were also some other fundamental things that happened where response used to be at strictly a state level, and it was hard to coordinate across states. Now that's allowed. And by far the most important thing that came out of Katrina was that public assistance funding that's described in the Stafford Act was extended to cultural institutions. That is, cultural institutions that are nonprofits that need resources to start a recovery or to start a response. Those have to be applied for. You don't get those immediately, but typically in a presidential declaration, public assistance is one of the phases and one of the things that's authorized. And in the past, cultural institutions generally could not apply for that. It was something that they had to go to the Small Business Administration for support. So Katrina and that legislation did get expanded in a way that really did allow for items that aren't protected in other ways to receive some sort of response in an organized way. It also showed that just from the sheer scale, that you have less control the bigger it is. And you need to be as prepared as you can be and do what you can if you can. One of the things that also changed after Katrina was the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. Originally, the task force was focused on the wheel and essentially information and documents that people could use, but it was not really a proactive responder in the sense of an emergencies. And it really has transformed itself into a group of organizations, Library of Congress is one of them, that collectively represent the cultural heritage in our nation and try to gather information in how to respond to incidents that happen. I was at a call a few weeks ago about the flooding in Louisiana around the Cane River. So this is something that's really changed, where this is a small organization focused on sort of publications that's really transformed itself into a way that we can respond to emergencies. Heritage preservation has come on some hard times, and fortunately, one of the things that has happened is that while heritage preservation no longer exists, this whole task force has now been taken on by the Smithsonian. So it's an incredibly important organization that ties together the cultural, our cultural partners, be they historic properties, be they museums, be they libraries and archives. The Alliance for Response is another historic preservation effort that's been folded into the FAIC, and it organizes at a local level so that at a city level, at a regional level, there are people that are focused on response for cultural materials. We have the Haiti, and I should add, I've left this out, even though I mentioned it in my introduction, that another component of this is that the FAIC started what at the time was the Collections Emergency Response Team, of which I'm a member, that's now called the National Heritage Responders. That is a group of people that can be sent nationally, sometimes internationally, as they were for the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project, to support recovery and response efforts. It doesn't have a great deal of funds, but it does have a trained cadre of people, about 100 people that can go to different places, be deployed, and that technical expertise, there's now a mechanism to deploy it, and that certainly did not exist at Katrina, and Katrina really started that. The Smithsonian has really taken a lead lately in cultural emergency management projects, in part because of their peculiar identity as a federal entity as opposed to an agency. Their trust funds allow them a flexibility and a nimbleness that not all other agencies have. And they really took the lead in the response to the devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010 and initiated the Cultural Recovery Project and a Cultural Recovery Center with training and assessment that included the National Heritage Responders, but also a large number of Smithsonian staff. It's a noteworthy accomplishment. AIC followed this model after Superstorm Sandy, and Cultural Recovery Center that was in Brooklyn. And this is, again, a distinction about when we're talking about these different phases that we need to be mindful of, that in this case, we're really talking about recovery. A lot of the response was really done by Alliance for Response team in New York City in particular, and that we really were in a position of helping people in long-term recovery. Another thing that the Smithsonian has really been focusing on, because of Corey Wegner, is how to safeguard cultural heritage in areas of war. That goes back to, obviously, the Monuments Men. Corey's been a dogged advocate for this since her experience in Iraq as an officer, and she's continued to do that, and the Smithsonian has brought her in the fold, and they've really been making an enormous amount of effort to build on what happened in Haiti, but also to help with heritage that's at risk in places like Palmyra. So what now? We're in a very different place in some respects from Florence. We have resources, we have experience, we have knowledge. What do we need? Well, one of the things I feel like we need to know when we have an emergency where it is, and we need to, in the sense of where are our collections at risk, where are our institutions at risk, what do we have, where is it, and has it been damaged? I was just in the call that I was on where we had questions about things on the historic register that we didn't know. We didn't know exactly what we were what was in the affected area, and we didn't know if it had been damaged. We need to do a better job of that. We need to be more resilient. We need to work on what, in some respects, people call weak relationships. That is, not your primary relationship, but the people you know. And the most vulnerable institutions are small ones where they don't have a cadre of helpers or people that are aware of them. They may be a small historical society that has a very small staff of maybe even one. We need to foster more relationships so that those people not only can ask for help, but even if they don't ask for help, people know that they're there and will help them. And frankly, all institutions need more staff. The reason that we don't have as much of the work on emergency planning as we should is, I think, because staffs are under a lot of pressure, and staffs are generally below the high water mark that they had in better times. It's going to be real hard to create those plans if you don't have a lot of staff. And we need to focus on vulnerabilities and importance. Do we want to focus on the most vulnerable institutions, or do we want to focus on the most important items? How do we balance that out? We can do both, but how do we set our priorities? How do we do triage? Kaizuna is a term that I learned when I was in Japan. I went to Japan in 2011 after the earthquake at the request of the National Diet Library, and it's a notion of fellowship and relationships in difficult times. And I think that's that element that I think we can foster as we focus on developing plans and relationships. Alliance for Response is an excellent grassroots way to do that. How do we make those connections between those folks, people at, say, at the national level? How do we integrate this in a way so that we're ready and we're resilient? Let's take just a look at a project that's really interesting in Washington State. They've been really focusing on this mapping issue. And they have a GIS system, a mapping system that basically maps the whole state in various ways, assessing risk. And so one of them is looking at an earthquake of 7.2 that would happen in Seattle. So right here, right in this area where all that red is, right in there. This is Seattle right there, and there's that's the water. Seattle's over here. A high-risk area. So one of the things they've done is they've started to focus on mapping where things are and how they might be. So what would happen if there was how severe would a 7.2, this is the scenario, this is an earthquake, it would be centered around Seattle and have this ring around it. And as you'll see on the right side, they've added hospitals. This is where all the hospitals are in the area on this map, and they're mapped in degree of damage. And this takes into account a number of things. It takes into account not just, well, that it's in the zone, but why are these blue even though they're in the worst area? These are newer hospitals. They're well built. They're seismically prepared. They are ready. This hospital knows that. They can incorporate that into their planning. And if you're trying to respond to hospitals being damaged in the area, these are not going to be as high on your list necessarily as these. They've done it for schools. There are a lot of schools in this area, but this gives you the same sense. This is something, it's a tool that both can be used in terms of response, in terms of where are the schools, how concerned should we be about them, but also what kind of school it is. There's a lot of data behind this, but also for schools to get ready, then they know I'm at risk. I'm in a really seismically active area. My building is old. I need to do something. These are things that we don't have for cultural institutions, and we should. It can be done. It's just a matter of who does it and a will to do it. But we spend a lot of time on our National Emergency Task Force calls trying to just divine what got damaged and what might be damaged. We should not be in that situation. We should do a better job, and we should do this kind of thing. It would help us with our planning. Would help us with our preparedness, and it would help us make the case for why these institutions may need more staff to do these kinds of things, and to keep them engaged in that process of emergency preparedness and response and recovery and training. We spend a lot of time on that here, as many of my audience members are on our emergency response team. We spend a lot of time on this because we want to be ready, and that's where we need to support smaller, more vulnerable institutions that need that support. And we should keep in mind that we may have to make some difficult decisions about what we recover, when we recover it. But we should also be informed by Florence that despite a very devastating flood and despite a passage of 50 years, that all of their major artworks are treated now with the completion of this treatment. And it did happen 50 years later, but it had been stabilized. And we need to make a better case for what we mean when we say, I've treated it, I've completed the recovery effort, we've saved the object, but we may need to rehabilitate it, and that may take significant time and funds. But that's just the reality of the way these things work. And I have the illustration of the books on the side. It's the same thing. There are thousands of books that still need to be treated, but they're stable, and they will eventually be completed. So with that, I have a lot of people to thank. Many of you are on this list, and if you feel that you should be on this list, please tell me. It's a lot of people. This goes back to the Kaizuna principle. There are a lot of people that you get to know doing this kind of work, working on this kind of area, and it's really important. You'll see this whole column here. All of these people here are library folks that have nothing to do directly with collections. They take care of our building, they take care of our infrastructure, they keep us safe, but we have a very integrated approach with collection security. It ranges from physical security to emergency response to environment. It's a core part of what we do, and all of those folks deserve a lot of credit. And for those out in Webland, if you want to contact me, this is the way you can do that. You can send your praise or your arrows my way. I really look forward to getting everybody's feedback, and I know we're almost done with the time, but I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's lunchtime. People are hungry. Jeannie.
Andrew, just a point of clarification about
Sure.
the Smithsonian, because of course they are working with FEMA, and the person at the Smithsonian actually works for FEMA, but it has been appointed to Smithsonian. Is that not correct, or am I misunderstanding? I thought that Lori Foley, she actually works for FEMA, but she's been assigned to Smithsonian. Is that right, or am I incorrect?
That's the current status. Lori Foley used to work at the Northeast Document Conservation Center. She was co-chair of the emergency committee with me while I was at AIC. I talked with her frequently. She then went to Heritage Preservation, and as part of how the different tasks of Heritage Preservation were devolved, she was hired by FEMA. But the understanding is that I understand it is that while she's detailed to the Smithsonian now, that at some point, I think the expectation is that her position will actually transfer to the Smithsonian. But that this was done as a way of just making that transition faster.
And I was just trying to make that connection between FEMA and the Smithsonian and to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lori's actually online.
Hi, Lori. She can correct me if I've kind of gotten those details wrong. Yes.
How long were you in Japan helping with recovery efforts?
So that's the interesting thing. The conversation started, the request started in late February. But I did, or excuse me, late March, because the earthquake was in March 11th. The request sort of came in late March, but I didn't get there until September. So that's one of those things, too, about there's a difference between what you do when you start having a conversation with people right after this happens with what happens when you're there. And really, people are in a long-term recovery mode. There still were a lot of devastation, a lot of debris removal, but when we went up to the Tohoku region, I was there for about a week. It was really something of just, more than anything else, being the person to listen and to encourage them. The technical part of what they're doing in recovering those personal photographs is really amazing. And I think it was something that I gave a very similar kind of talk there in terms of what I see from the from the response in Japan broadly for cultural material. It's very narrow, and they don't have as expansive a way of interconnecting these different needs. There isn't something like the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. The cross-professional ties, cross-institutional ties are weaker, and it really creates problems when they have a very robust list of national treasures, but things fall off the list very quickly. So things like legal records fell to the Department of Justice to take care of, and it was not a very organized response, although ambitious. And it's the kind of thing that hopefully that was helpful to them. The encouragement I know was helpful, but I was there for about 2 weeks overall, and even at that time, I mean, it shows you too with something like that really was a national disaster. I mean, even when I was there were power shortages, other kinds of issues. It was still even 6 months after an eye-opening experience for how devastating something like that can be, and I think a real reminder that while you can prepare as much as you can be in situations where even months after the fact, you're still falling short on resources and other things.
Oh. What is the current planning with respect to climate change and all of the projections with respect to sea level rise, stronger storms?
Well, I mean that's you could go back. If I go back to this kind of model, I mean, that's why the mapping is so important. I mean, you can take a model like this and you can apply it to sea level change, whether you want to talk about storm surges from hurricanes or you want to talk about rising water levels. It's a part of risk management, and if you're near one of these areas, that should be something you're mindful of. And it's why on the emergency management side, it's so important to have that comprehensive approach, because you should be able to then adjust your risk assessment to take into account things like that. But certainly, proximity to water is a huge risk factor. I mean, Florence tells you that I mean, Florence isn't going to move, but cultural material that's near the river is vulnerable, and as would be things near coasts or where sea levels are rising. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much. We can complete.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.